starts with the money, but it never stops there. Just let me spell out where a post-American world leads. A is for addiction. We spend too much. It's not a revenue issue, it's a spending issue. The United States joined the rest of a cosseted Western world in voting itself a lifestyle it was not willing to pay for, and indeed can never pay for. Because when you spend $4 trillion, but you only take in $2 trillion, which is the federal government model, you can never close that gap with revenue. When government spends on the scale Washington's got used to, it's not a spending crisis, it's a moral one. There's nothing virtuous about caring, compassionate progressives demonstrating how caring and compassionate and progressive they are by spending money yet to be earned by generations yet to be born. We are looting the future to bribe the present. Indeed, we have looted the future to such an extent it's no longer clear we have one. And that's what so-called fiscal conservatives often miss. It's not a green eye-shade issue. Increasing dependency, disincentivizing self-reliance, absolving the citizenry from responsibility for their actions, the multi-trillion-dollar debt catastrophe is not the problem, but merely the symptom. And this is where I disagree with Mitch Daniels and some others. It's not about balancing the books. It's about rebalancing the very structures of society. R is for redistribution. Leftists often talk about redistribution of wealth. When you're redistributing from the future to the present, you are redistributing wealth that has not yet been created, wealth that does not exist. Meanwhile, day by day in this republic, we see an unprecedented transfer of resources from the productive class to the obstructive class, to government, to regulators, to bureaucracies. So if much of this wealth does not yet exist, what exactly are we redistributing? We're redistributing liberty. We're delivering a self-governing republic into rule by regulators, bureaucrats, and social engineers. Just this week, the formerly golden state of California, a broke jurisdiction whose rapacious government and dependency class are driving what's left of the productive class to flee its borders. Just this last week, the state announced that its burning priority is that it needs to regulate bedsheets in motels and hotels. It will be illegal under the California sheet regime for motels and hotels to put non-fitted sheets on their beds. And so there will be a sheet regulatory regime with sheet regulatory enforcers kicking down the door of room 73 of the Orange Grove Motel to check they're in compliance with the California sheet regime. You can try to resist, but they'll kick the sheet out of you. There is an apocryphal Orwell quotation to describe the way pacifists, even pacifists, assume the soldiery are there to defend the realm. Quote, "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf," unquote. Ha! Says the state of California. People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because the state agency of sheet regulation stands ready to do violence to innkeepers with non-elasticated sheets. By the way, if there's any Ku Klux Klan members here tonight, because I know you Tea Party guys, I know what it's really about. So if there's any Ku Klux Klan members here tonight, if you're planning on flying in for a lodge meeting with a Grand Kleagle in California, you will need a fitted sheet, okay? When Canada decriminalized homosexuality, Pierre Trudeau said the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. But California says, oh, yes, we do, if you're consummating your same-sex marriage on a non-compliant sheet. And so it goes. I was talking to an undocumented immigrant from Tijuana, and he says that California is already a byword for sheet government. These are not trivial things. They represent the remorseless redistribution of liberty. 7-year-old Julie Murphy was selling lemonade in Portland, Oregon, when 2 officers demanded to see her temporary restaurant license, which would have cost her $120. When she failed to produce it, These officers threatened her with a $500 fine. She's a 7-year-old girl. They also made her cry. Now, when I read these stories, there was another one in the papers just the other day, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. An 11-year-old girl in Virginia, Shyla Capo, had rescued a woodpecker from the clutches of a cat, spent a few days nursing it back to health before releasing it. An agent of the United States Department of Fish and Wildlife arrived along with an escort of Virginia state troopers to deliver a $535 fine to the little girl who rescued the woodpecker for the federal crime of transporting a protected species of woodpecker. She transported it out of the mouth of the cat who was eating it. Serve the cat with the $535 fine for illegally transporting the woodpecker down your gullet. These are not small things. Two officers shake down the 7-year-old girl for the $500 lemonade stand fine. Officers from two agencies, federal and state, make the 11-year-old girl, Shyla Capo, cry for rescuing the woodpecker. They should be ashamed of themselves. This is not a small thing. They do not understand the relationship between the citizen and the state. When I read these stories, I'm always reminded of Saudi Arabia's religious police, the Mutaween, the Commission for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vices. Except in this case, our religious police, the religion they're enforcing is state power. Perhaps like the fierce, bearded men of the Mutaween, the cheerless scolds of Permit Stan could be issued with whips and scourges to flay the grade school sinners in the street, the way the Mutaween do in Riyadh and Jeddah. When life hands you lemons, you make lemonade and then watch the state enforcers turn it back into sour fruit. Ask yourself this. It's exactly the same thing as with gun control. Gun control is not about guns, it's about control. Woodpecker control is not about woodpeckers, it's about control. Lemonade control is not about lemonade, it's about control. If a second grader can no longer sell homemade lemonade in her front yard without $500 worth of permits, what aspect of your life can't the government regulate? For more and more Americans, law has been supplanted by regulation. A governing set of rules not legislated by representatives accountable to the people, but invented by an activist bureaucracy, much of which is well to the left of either political party. You may remember that Congress stripped provisions for end-of-life counseling, the so-called death panels, out of the Obamacare bill. But Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, put them back on her say-so. Why shouldn't she? The new law contains 700 references to the Secretary, quote, shall, another 200 to the Secretary, quote, may, and 139 to the Secretary, quote, determines. So the Secretary may and shall determine pretty much anything she wants. Plucked at random, quote, the Secretary shall develop oral health care components that shall include tooth-level surveillance, unquote. Tooth-level surveillance. That phrase is hitherto unknown to human history. But it's in Obamacare. George III never went in for tooth-level surveillance. If the stories about George Washington's wooden teeth were true, that would have killed the American Revolution right there and then. I'm not sure even Colonel Gaddafi goes in for tooth-level surveillance. From colonial subjects to dentured servitude in a mere quarter millennium. M is for monopoly. M is for monopoly. I mentioned a moment ago that the Aspen Ideas Festival has great thinkers like Barbra Streisand. So I would like to cite another great thinker, George Harrison of the Beatles. In 1969, George Harrison, in the course of a wide-ranging ramble, briefly detoured out of the Hare Krishna chants and LSD into some remarks about the Monopolies Commission, which is the British version of the US Antitrust Division. And he goes, this is the thing I don't like. It's the Monopolies Commission. Now, if anybody, Kodak or somebody, is cleaning up the market with film, The Monopolies Commission, the government send them in there and say, you know, you're not allowed to monopolise. Yet when the government's monopolising, who's going to send in the Monopolies Commission to sort that one out? That is one of the most brilliant observations on government that has ever been made. There was an old joke in Britain at the time. Why is there only one Monopolies Commission? It is, in fact, an incisive observation on the nature of government. We wouldn't like it if there was only one automobile company or only one breakfast cereal, but by definition there can only be one government, which is why when, in George's words, when the government's monopolising, it should do so only in very limited areas. And that's particularly true for national governments when the nation they govern has more than 300 million people dispersed over a continent. But I think it gets worse than that, because it's not just a monopoly of power. Right now, we have rule by a monopoly of ideas, which is the most dangerous monopoly of all. In fact, a kind of monopoly of grey matter, as it were. Take, for example, our so-called meritocracy. We're ruled by, effectively, not technocrats, not a meritocracy, but a cartel of conformicrats who impose essentially a sterile monopoly of outmoded ideas. You may remember the day after President Obama's election, Michael Beschloss hailed him as, quote, probably the smartest guy ever to become president, unquote. Why would you say such a thing? I mean, other than an impressive talent for self-promotion, what has he ever done? Even as a legendary thinker, what original thought has he ever expressed in his entire life? And yet he's, quote, probably the smartest guy ever to become president, says Michael Beschloss, and he's a presidential historian, so he should know because he's a smart guy too. And lending a hand, another smart guy, David Brooks, the House conservative at the New York Times, hailed the incoming administration as a collection of super smart eggheads credentialed to their hilt, quote, if a foreign enemy attacks the United States during the Harvard-Yale game any time over the next 4 years, we're screwed, unquote. He was right. Over a quarter of Obama's political appointees had ties to Harvard. Over 90% had advanced degrees, and yet we're screwed anyway. How did that happen? What kind of super smart guys all think the same thing? We are governed by conformicrats who live in a self-reinforcing bubble. We have a ruling class that thinks alike and cannot conceive that anyone other than a racist, a terrorist, or a mentally ill lunatic like my sometime colleague at Fox News, poor Juan Williams, when he got fired from NPR for accidentally wandering off the reservation for 30 seconds. They did what they do in the Soviet Union. They say, oh, we're just going to send you to the sanatorium, lie down here, let the men in white coats strap you up, you'll soon be feeling much better, Juan. The New York Times ostentatiously recruits its staff by sending its editors to hire people at the African American Journalist Convention, the Women Journalist Convention, the Hispanic Journalist Convention, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual and Transgender Journalist Convention. It recruits on the basis of diversity of race, diversity of gender, diversity of orientation, every diversity except the only one that matters, diversity of ideas. And if anyone could use some new ideas right now, it's America's wretched elite ruling class.